vaccines.
One of my friends sent me a series of pictures that he had seen on the dating app Tinder. And people had in their bios things like, if you vote right, then swipe left, which I'm sure you're not familiar with the app Tinder, but that basically means, swipe, I don't want anything to do with you type of thing. So as a historian, I would love to ask you, with what seems like there's this over politicization of everything, are we more divided now than we've ever been before?
Well, let me make clear that I never have used Tinder. I'm a happily married man, and wouldn't know where to begin with it.
Shout out to Ian.
Just so that we're all on the same page. But it's actually an interesting point you make, that party politics seems to infest every aspect of life, even whom you'll date. And I think opinion polls show that tolerance of the other party has declined significantly in the US. People are much more likely to say they'll disown their child if the child marries someone of the wrong party than they were 20 or 30 years ago. I think on some bases that makes it hard to argue against the proposition that we've never been more divided. On the other hand, if one goes back a long way to before the time of opinion polls, it's pretty clear that Americans were more divided at the time of the Civil War than they are today. I mean, a lot of what goes on social media is very vituperative, and occasionally it spills over into real world violence. But by the standards of the 19th century, it's pretty low level violence. I don't think the United States is going to end up in another civil war. In fact, I think in some ways, all the ranting and raving on Twitter is a substitute for most people for actual political conflict. And it's like kids playing violent video games. All my sons have done this. I'm still waiting for one of them to become a serial killer. It doesn't seem that likely. So I think there's a lot of kind of venting going on that really isn't that consequential. I also think that if you look back, you don't need to go all the way to the Civil War, to the time I'm writing about at the moment in the second volume of my biography of Henry Kissinger. The late 1960s and the early 1970s were a profoundly divisive, divided time in American history. And it wasn't just that people were venting, people were getting assassinated. Think of 1968, Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy. If you look at the violence on campuses as well as in inner cities in the early 1970s, it's much worse than anything we see today. So I think we mustn't make the mistake of thinking that outrage on social media reflects really profound division. I think we've actually been more dangerously divided, more violently divided in the past than we are now. And I would say if one looks at the UK, and I'm old enough to do this, the divisions seem tame compared with the divisions of the 70s and 80s, particularly I think back to the first Thatcher government, a time of strikes and a really intense atmosphere of political polarization in the country. Although Brexit seemed to create one of those really deep rifts that occasionally happen in British history, my sense, though I'm saying this from thousands of miles away, my sense is that those are not going to be very lasting divisions. Indeed, one can already see in the polling quite an interesting shift that's happened. If you had been a master strategist trying to work out how best to legitimize Brexit just at the moment when its costs were being felt, you couldn't have done better than the way the EU screwed up the early part of their vaccination strategy. I mean, they're catching up now, and it only really meant the loss of weeks, maybe months, but they made such a mess of it in just the way that critics of Europe have long characterized the EU. It was bureaucratic, it was centralizing, but it also was incompetent. And So I sense that apparently deep division in the UK is in some ways healing, because in a funny kind of way, the events of 2021, particularly the events of this year, have sort of legitimized the case for Brexit in a way that, to an old Remainer like me, and I was very much a Remainer in 2016, has been fascinating to watch. I mean, well done, Ursula von der Leyen. You really did the job there of confirming that the decision to leave was right. And I see people who were Remainers in 2016 have kind of, I sense they've kind of thrown in the towel at this point.